The room was never meant to fall silent. This was a global summit. Thousands of delegates from every corner of the world, translators whispering into headsets, laptops clicking, cameras humming, people half listening while scrolling through phones. It was the kind of event where applause was polite, attention was divided, and speakers blended into one another like background noise. But then, a man walked onto the stage who did not look like power. He was Filipino, slightly hunched, holding his notes too tightly, his accent unmistakable before he even spoke. Some glanced at the program, unsure how to pronounce his name. Others leaned back, assuming this would be another forgettable talk squeezed between coffee breaks. No one expected what happened next. Because in the next 20 minutes, this man would do something no keynote speaker before him had done. He would stop the scrolling. He would silence the whispers. He would make world leaders forget their titles. And when he finished, the room would remain quiet, not because they were unimpressed, but because no one dared to break the weight of what they had just heard. He did not begin with statistics. He did not open with polished jokes or dramatic slides. Instead, he paused. A long pause. Uncomfortable. The kind that makes audiences shift in their seats. Then he spoke softly, almost apologetically. "I come from a place," he said, "where silence means survival." Instantly, something changed. Interpreters slowed down. Heads lifted. He explained how, as a child in a small Filipino town battered by storms and poverty, silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Silence meant listening for danger. Silence meant learning before speaking. Silence meant knowing when to endure and when to rise. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was telling the truth. And that truth carried something many speakers lack. Wait. The audience did not realize it yet, but they were already leaning in, because authenticity has a sound of its own. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It simply arrives, uninvited, and demands to be felt. As the talk unfolded, the man revealed that he was never supposed to be there. He spoke of rejection letters, ignored emails, and a lifetime of being told his voice was too small for global platforms. English, he said, was not his first language, and for years, people treated his accent as proof that his ideas were incomplete. He described being laughed at during international meetings, interrupted mid-sentence, and praised only when he stayed quiet. The audience shifted again, but this time with discomfort, because many of them recognized themselves in his story, not as victims, but as the ones who dismissed voices like his. Without accusing anyone, he held up a mirror. "When you ignore an accent," he said calmly, "you are not ignoring language. You are ignoring history." That single sentence landed like a thunderclap. Cameras zoomed in. Pens stopped moving. This was no longer a speech. It was a reckoning. He began weaving his personal story with the history of the Philippines, not as a lecture, but as lived experience. He spoke of colonization not as a distant concept, but as something that shaped how his grandparents spoke, how his parents dreamed, and how he himself learned to measure his worth in foreign approval. He explained how Filipinos learned to adjust, adapt, and absorb other cultures, often at the cost of their own voices. "We were taught to be understood," he said, "but not to be heard." The room was silent now, not the restless kind, but the heavy, intentional kind. Even the translators paused between phrases, careful not to dilute the meaning. This Filipino speaker was not asking for sympathy. He was explaining something far more unsettling, that the world had grown comfortable benefiting from Filipino resilience without ever truly listening to Filipino pain. Halfway through the talk, something unexpected happened. He stopped again, looked around the room, and smiled, not confidently, but gently. "You are very quiet," he said. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. "That," he continued, "is how my people feel when the world finally listens." He explained how Filipinos are known globally as nurses, caregivers, seafarers, and domestic workers, present everywhere, heard nowhere. He told stories of overseas Filipino workers sending money home while missing funerals, birthdays, and entire childhoods. He did not dramatize their suffering. He honored their endurance. "We export labor," he said, voice steady, "but import silence." By now, Some audience members were visibly emotional. This was no longer about one man on a stage. It was about millions of lives that had been reduced to footnotes in global conversations. Then came the moment that would later go viral, the turning point that would be clipped, shared, subtitled, and replayed millions of times online. He asked a simple question: how many of you have benefited from Filipino work? Almost every hand went up. He nodded. Now, he added softly, how many of you have heard a Filipino lead the conversation? No hands moved. The silence was complete. No coughs. No shuffling. Just stillness. He didn't rush to fill it. He let it breathe. Because sometimes, silence speaks louder than outrage. This was not an attack. It was an invitation to recognize imbalance, to confront convenience, to admit complicity without defensiveness. The room was no longer a room. It was a confession chamber. In the final stretch of his talk, the Filipino speaker did something most keynote speakers are afraid to do. He made himself vulnerable. He spoke of moments when he almost chose silence permanently. Times he questioned whether speaking up was worth the exhaustion, the misunderstanding, the risk of being labeled too emotional or too political. He admitted that even standing on that stage felt unnatural to him. I was trained to serve, he said, not to lead. That sentence shattered something inside the audience. Because leadership, as they realized in that moment, had been narrowly defined. His presence challenged that definition, not through dominance, but through dignity. He was not commanding the room. He was trusting it. And that trust made the silence sacred. As he approached the end, his voice did not rise. It softened. This is not a demand, he said. It is a reminder. He reminded the audience that progress does not always sound like confidence. Sometimes it sounds like an accent you are not used to. Sometimes it sounds like a story you've never been taught to value. He urged institutions to move beyond diversity as optics and toward inclusion as listening. If you truly want global solutions, he concluded, you must first hear global voices. There was no dramatic music cue. No call for applause. Just truth laid bare. When the 20 minutes ended, no one clapped immediately. And that was the most powerful reaction of all. The silence lingered, not awkwardly, but reverently. People sat frozen, absorbing what had just happened. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared at the stage as if hoping he would say more. But he simply nodded, stepped back, and left the stage quietly, just as he had entered. The applause came later, slow, rising, unstoppable. A standing ovation followed, but it felt almost secondary. The real impact had already been delivered in silence. Within hours, clips of the talk spread across social media. Headlines followed. The speech that stopped the room. A Filipino voice the world couldn't ignore. But the speaker himself remained unreachable. He returned to his hotel room, called his mother in the Philippines, and said simply, "Ma, I spoke." She cried. Because for the first time, the world had not only heard a Filipino accent, it had listened. And that, more than applause or viral fame, was the true victory. The silence he created did not end inside that conference hall. It followed him out into the world. By the next morning, the talk had been uploaded by multiple attendees, each version slightly shaky, filmed from different angles, yet all carrying the same weight. Viewers from Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas watched the same moment unfold. A Filipino man standing alone on a massive stage, not raising his voice, not demanding attention, yet somehow commanding it completely. Comment sections filled rapidly, not with debates, but with confessions. Nurses in London wrote about feeling seen for the first time. Seafarers in Dubai shared clips with captions that read, "This is us." Students in Manila stayed up past midnight replaying the speech, stunned that someone who sounded like them had made the world stop and listen. What began as a single talk quietly transformed into a collective awakening, one that crossed borders without asking permission. Mainstream media soon followed, but awkwardly. Headlines struggled to categorize what had happened. Was it a motivational speech? A political statement? A cultural critique? Editors searched for labels because the truth didn't fit neatly into any box. He wasn't angry enough to be radical. He wasn't polished enough to be conventional. And yet, his impact was undeniable. News anchors replayed the clip of raised hands followed by silence, pausing it dramatically as if to amplify the discomfort. Analysts debated why the moment felt so powerful. Some credited storytelling. Others pointed to timing. But few admitted the simplest explanation: the world had underestimated Filipino voices for far too long, and this talk exposed that blind spot in real time. As interviews poured in, the speaker declined most of them. Not out of arrogance, but caution. He understood how quickly narratives could be reshaped once they left his mouth. When he did speak, he refused to position himself as a hero. "I am not the story," he said in one rare interview. "I am evidence. Evidence that brilliance can carry an accent. Evidence that humility can hold authority. Evidence that silence, when used intentionally, can dismantle power structures louder than shouting ever could." This refusal to self-mythologize only deepened public respect. In an age of personal branding, he chose restraint. And that restraint echoed the very lesson of his talk. Not everything meaningful needs to be amplified to be powerful. Meanwhile, institutions quietly began to feel the pressure. Universities invited him to speak, not for commencement speeches, but for closed-door sessions with leadership. International organizations reviewed their speaker lineups and noticed patterns they could no longer ignore. Filipino professionals working behind the scenes were suddenly being asked for opinions instead of instructions. Some described it as subtle, others as overdue. One overseas Filipino worker wrote, "Nothing changed on my payslip, but something changed in how my boss looks at me." That shift, though invisible on paper, was seismic. Because respect, once cracked open, rarely closes completely again. Back in the Philippines, the reaction was deeply personal. Families gathered around phones, replaying the speech on small screens, pausing to explain certain lines to grandparents who didn't speak English fluently but understood the emotion instantly. Teachers used clips in classrooms, not to teach public speaking, but courage. For many young Filipinos, this was the first time they saw global validation without cultural erasure. He did not neutralize his accent. He did not simplify his story. He stood fully Filipino, and the world adjusted, not the other way around. That reversal mattered more than any award. Criticism, of course, followed, as it always does when silence disrupts comfort. Some dismissed the talk as emotional manipulation. Others accused him of playing the victim. A few questioned whether his experience represented real, global inequality. He responded to none of it. "If my story offends you," he later said quietly, "perhaps it is touching something unresolved." That sentence circulated almost as widely as the original speech. Because it revealed something uncomfortable, that discomfort is often the first sign of learning, not injustice. What made the talk endure was not its virality, but its rewatchability. People didn't just share it, they returned to it. Each viewing revealed something new. A pause that now felt intentional, a phrase that carried deeper meaning, a look in his eyes that suggested years of swallowed words. Communication experts began analyzing the speech frame by frame, noting how he used pacing instead of volume, stillness instead of gestures. He didn't dominate the space, he invited it. And in doing so, he changed how effective speaking was defined. Power, they realized, does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it arrives prepared to listen first. Behind the scenes, the speaker returned to an ordinary life. No entourage. No dramatic lifestyle shift. He went back to mentoring young professionals, many of whom still doubted their voices mattered. Now, when they asked him how to speak with confidence, he gave an unexpected answer: "Stop trying to sound like someone else." He explained that the world already has enough echoes. What it lacks are original frequencies. His advice wasn't about pronunciation or posture. It was about permission, the permission to exist fully, audibly, unapologetically. The 20-minute talk began appearing in unexpected places. Diversity trainings, leadership workshops, church youth sessions, even corporate boardrooms. In each setting, the same moment caused the same reaction: the raised hands, followed by silence. People shifted uncomfortably every time. Because the question had not expired. It remained painfully current. Who does the work? Who gets the voice? And why have we accepted that imbalance as normal? The Filipino speaker never answered those questions for the audience. He trusted them to sit with it. That trust was radical. Months later, when asked whether he realized his talk would become global, he shook his head. "I only hoped," he said, "that someone would listen." In that simple statement lay the heart of the entire moment. This was never about fame or recognition. It was about reclaiming the right to be heard, without permission, without translation, without apology. And in reclaiming that right for himself, he unknowingly reclaimed it for millions of others who had been taught to stay quiet. The silence he created was not emptiness. It was space. Space for voices that had waited far too long. Long after the cameras were packed away and the trending hashtags faded, the silence he created continued to work quietly in places no algorithm could track. Conference organizers began questioning their definition of global experts. Instead of flying in the same familiar voices, they started asking who had been doing the work without the microphone. Filipino professionals, once introduced as support staff or technical contributors, were now invited to lead panels, moderate discussions, and frame conversations. It did not happen everywhere, and it did not happen overnight. But it happened enough to matter. The talk had planted a seed that credibility is not tied to accent, and leadership does not require cultural imitation. In boardrooms and classrooms alike, that idea lingered, challenging long-held assumptions each time someone spoke differently, but spoke with truth. For the Filipino speaker himself, legacy was never a word he used comfortably. When people called him inspirational, he corrected them gently. "I am not inspiration," he said. "I am reflection." He wanted audiences to see themselves in the discomfort, the silence, the realization. He continued refusing awards that centered him alone, instead redirecting attention to Filipino communities whose labor sustained economies worldwide. In doing so, he modeled a rare form of influence, one that expands outward rather than upward. His impact wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about making symbols unnecessary by normalizing Filipino leadership in global spaces. Perhaps the most profound change occurred quietly, within individuals who never met him. A Filipino student in Europe stopped apologizing before speaking in class. A nurse in Canada corrected a supervisor who dismissed her suggestion. A young professional in Manila applied for an international role without changing his name or softening his accent. None of these moments made headlines. None went viral. But together, they formed something far more powerful than a trending speech, a shift in self-perception. The silence he created had given people permission to hear themselves differently, to recognize that confidence does not always roar, and dignity does not need translation. Communication scholars would later describe the talk as a masterclass in restraint. They noted how he resisted the urge to climax emotionally, how he allowed pauses to carry meaning, how he trusted the audience enough to sit in discomfort without rescue. But what those analyses often missed was the cultural intelligence behind it. This was not accidental minimalism. It was shaped by generations taught to observe before acting, to listen before responding, to endure before speaking. His method was deeply Filipino, even as its message was universal. That contradiction, being culturally specific yet globally resonant, was precisely what made it unforgettable. Years from now, many who watch the speech will forget the name of the event, the city it was held in, even the exact words he spoke. But they will remember how it felt. The tightness in the chest when the room went quiet. The sudden awareness of whose voices were missing. The realization that listening is an active, moral choice. That emotional memory is the true measure of the talk's success. Not metrics, not views, but the way it permanently altered how people hear others and themselves. In the Philippines, the talk quietly entered the cultural bloodstream. Not as a viral trend, but as a reference point. Remember the speech, people would say when encouraging someone to speak up. It became shorthand for courage without aggression, pride without arrogance. It reminded a nation long accustomed to adapting that adaptation does not require erasure. You can belong to the world without shrinking yourself to fit it. That message, spoken once on a distant stage, found its way home, stronger, clearer, and deeply rooted. What made the moment historic was not that the world listened, but that it did so without being forced. There were no chants, no protests, no raised fists. Just one Filipino voice, steady and honest, standing in its truth. In a time obsessed with volume, he proved that clarity can be quieter. That persuasion does not require performance. That sometimes, the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. The global audience was not silenced by shock. They were silenced by recognition. If there is a lesson hidden inside those 20 minutes, it is this: the future of global conversation will not be led by those who speak the loudest, but by those who speak the truest. The world is no longer short on information, it is short on listening. And listening begins when we stop deciding in advance whose voices matter. The Filipino speaker did not ask for space. He occupied it, calmly, respectfully, fully. In doing so, he reminded the world that representation is not charity. It is justice. Today, the video still circulates quietly, shared not with captions of outrage, but of gratitude. This helped me. This is how I feel. This is our story. Each share is a continuation of the silence he created, a silence filled not with absence, but with acknowledgement. The talk did not end conversations. It began them. And it ensured that when Filipinos speak next, they will not be treated as interruptions, but as contributors. In the end, the most powerful thing about that 20-minute talk was not what the Filipino speaker said, but what he made possible. He reminded the world that voices shaped by humility can still carry authority, that accents carry history, not deficiency, and that sometimes, when one person finally speaks without apology, millions realize they never needed to be silent at all. The room may have been quiet that day, but the echoes of that moment will continue long after the applause has faded.